So take a second, prepare a quad chart for the next lesson, Red Revolution, as we shift from the Korean War to the early involvements in Vietnam. Before the Americans get involved in Vietnam, the Vietnamese have been experiencing quite a bit of oppression through colonialism, through their own struggles against the Japanese and the French. So we're going to look at what factors led to conflict in the First and Second Indochina Wars. Interesting quote from Sun Tzu, which is 100% true. All war is deception. A lot of you experienced that or tried to use some of that in your refight D-Day campaign that you put together. So deception is something that should always be employed, particularly at the small levels that we'll see initially with the guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. But as I started earlier, the Vietnamese people had really been experiencing brutal oppression by various different factions, initially China and Japan leading up to World War II, and during World War II, and in France as a colonial empire later. Really, they are a product of as a French colony. And as more and more of them started to receive Western education, they begin to fuel their own sense of nationalism, and it's something that education generally informs an oppressed people to revolution. And that's exactly what we see as some of their leaders become more and more educated in the way the West has educated its people. Of course, the leader that we're going to most often talk about in Vietnam is going to be Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh received his initial education in France and then later in the USSR. And then as a Soviet, he worked for an institution called the Comintern, or Communist International, which advocated for worldwide spread of communism. But Ho himself was a moderate when it comes to communists. He was really more about taking care of the Vietnamese people and removing that layer of colonialism and oppression that the French had on the Vietnamese people. He founds the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, gets a big following that starts behind him, and really makes a name for himself by leading the Viet Minh forces against the Japanese in World War II. Now, these were the only forces in Vietnam that had any type of discipline at all, and it's really due to a lot of Ho Chi Minh's leadership. But I wonder, who do you think was supporting the Viet Minh against the Japanese in World War II? If you said the Americans, then you'd be right. Here you see Ho Chi Minh and his lead general, former history teacher, General Zapp, who is being advised by American and British forces as they're fighting against the Japanese, as we're fighting against the Japanese as well in the Pacific during World War II. And this becomes a theme in American policy. I think that we create many of our own enemies by this type of activity. We see an interest in an area of the world. We help them with mill-to-mill programs, and then we create this capability that we then, they break away from us in one way or another. In this case, it's communism, and we find ourselves fighting with them later. Bringing up to the first Indochina War happening really at the end of World War II and up into the times we're involved in Korea, France comes back in and wants to reestablish control in Vietnam. They'd given that up when they were fighting World War II, and really when the problems were close hold to them against the Germans. They move in quickly and take control of the major cities, but they can't control the countryside. And this is where the Viet Minh guerrillas really start to thrive, and they maintain control of the countryside. They use classic hit and run tactics as part of a resistance. So they're going to attack where they can inflict the most casualties that they can find. And then they're going to withdraw to save their forces to fight another day. Communist victory against the United Nations in Korea really gives a morale boost to the Viet Minh fighting against the French. Chairman Mao also is providing weapons and training to the Viet Minh. Again, the primary communist belligerent in this region is China. So they're doing as much as they possibly can initially to man and equip the communist forces in Vietnam to oust the French. The Viet Minh commander is General Zapp, again, a former history teacher. I have his book back back here. So this book, The Military Art of People's War, is General Zapp's book. He lives through this. He lives through the fight against the French. He lives through the fight against the Americans, and it's one of the most well-read books by American generals. And one American general, Colin Powell, called General Zapp the greatest military leader since World War II, and that's a huge compliment. But this is a guy who learns lessons, and this book is about those lessons. But he learns the lessons as he's fighting on the battlefield with the French, and he applies those lessons later to us to defeat the Americans and keep the Americans out of Vietnam, or force them out of Vietnam. We'll talk about a couple of those as we go along. He realizes that he can't compete with the French force on force in the cities. He can't win on big, massive open battlefields. So he takes that fight to a location in the countryside where he thinks that he can do that. As he tries to fight, it becomes more and more like a stalemate, and he loses some of that support when the Chinese invade North Korea. Here are some of the resistance stalemate tactics. This is classic guerrilla warfare. We're only going to attack them in the open daylight when they have superior firepower. They're going to fight to hold the advantage and draw the French forces out of the cities where they can't use their technology and they have to fight at much closer distance. He's going to use guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics, magnetic warfare, attracting the French to him so that he can attack at his time and place of choosing where he has the advantage. He seeks peasant support. Support from the local populace is incredibly important to the guerrilla commander. Without the support from the local populace, he can't hide in plain sight. He can't blend in with the local population. And he can't get support like food, ammunition, weapons caches, and things like that. He must have peasant support, and General Zapp really builds a lot of that. They start to gain ground, right? So the Viet Minh control the Red River Delta, and that's an area in Vietnam that holds about a third of the population of Vietnamese people. It has the highest population density in Vietnam, and it has a big economic support to the Viet Minh, and then it produces 20% of the world's rice crop at that point in time. So he has a lot of assets that he can use to continue to sustain this war as long as it takes. The French people start to see that, and they see that they're losing, French blood and treasure in a war far away from France that they really don't need. So the French government starts to lose popular support for the war in Vietnam, and the French people start to demand the withdrawal of their forces. This is a lesson that is not lost on General Zapp. He will take this and apply it later when the Americans invade and come in and try to oust him there, and he knows that if he could just hold off until the government and the military loses support of the population back home, that he could outlast the enemy. And that's the classic strategy of employing guerrilla warfare in a resistance fight. Major battle really breaks the back of the French is at Dien Bien Phu, way up north in Vietnam, and it's a critical French base that's well in the heart of the Vietnamese communist. It's in an area where they can interdict the supply routes that go down inside of Laos and Cambodia that we later learn and call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We have similar outposts in our own experience in Vietnam, but this is one where General Zapp applies his advantage in numerical superiority and what he has in technology to defeat the French. Henry Navarre commands the mission there, and it's kind of in a low ground, right? And General Zapp occupies the high ground around Navarre and around the French, and he starts shelling into Dien Bien Phu, and he basically puts them in a siege-like condition, and then rains down artillery on top of it and attacks with 50,000 Viet Minh troops. They destroy the airfield. Without the airfield, they can't get critical supplies in. They can't get their wounded out. And it becomes a real battle of attrition that the French are losing very fast. And here you see the losses from the French, 2,200, almost 2,300 killed in action. The Viet Minh lose more, but they have more to lose at this point in the war, and the French don't because of eroding popular support. So the French withdraw. And as they withdraw, the French part of this war comes to a close. The meet in Geneva to divide the country of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, communist in the north and free in the south. They allowed, and it's something they didn't do in Korea. It's interesting. They allowed respective sympathizers. So Ho Chi Minh, again, as a moderate, allowed people who weren't on board with the communist narrative to move to the south. They allowed people who weren't on board, who had family members or whatever in the north, to move to the north to become communists. It was open initially, and then the U.S. backed the election of President Diem in South Korea, and he was supposed to allow free elections as part of the agreements in Geneva, and he decides not to do that, and he really becomes this almost like a dictator. He was very abrasive. His policies were really, really harmful to a lot of the people in the South, and he quickly loses public support. Diem was a Catholic, and the primary religion in that area is Buddhism. So, he would do things like closing the Buddhist temples and confiscating the things out of the Buddhist temples, and it really put off a lot of the Vietnamese population because he did not have respect for a freedom of religion. We really backed his leadership, and the reason he was able to stay kind of propped up for so long is that we were afraid of the location falling to communism. We hadn't gotten involved in there militarily yet. And because of the domino theory, we thought if they would fall, other countries would fall. So we propped up Diem and kind of held him in position. And in doing so, supported some really, really, you just can't, stupid policies. And one of those policies is the Strategic Hamlet Program. So in an effort to isolate the enemy and fight them, separate them from the civilian population that would be friendly, which is a classic maneuver to try to identify and defeat a guerrilla force. Instead of going in and befriending those people and giving them things that they needed, we took those people out of the environment and we built these compounds. So the strategic hamlets were compounds where locals were brought to. You can see here, there's a berm wall all the way around it. They were moved away from their home, away from their farms, away from where they had their place of kind of caring for themselves. And here, the government's going to take care of you. So the government will give you food. The government's going to come and take care of you. It sounds a lot like an Indian reservation in the United States. We all know that was a classic failure. Well, the same thing happens in the Strategic Hamlet Program. Pretty soon, the government can't support them anymore. They're no longer being taken care of, and they're still left out in the environment. And ultimately, it didn't provide really a way to separate them from the enemy, from the Viet Minh, and go after them and fight them. So one really classic failure where we supported the Diem administration. Our position becomes very different because the regime becomes so oppressive. Some of the things that start to happen are some of these Buddhist monks, and this happened more than one instance. It even happened in the United States with a U.S. citizen performing self-immolation outside of the Secretary of Defense's office in the Pentagon. But here we have a Buddhist monk protesting the Diem's oppression, who has poured gasoline on top of himself and has lit himself on fire in a means of protest against this massive oppression. As this oppression grows, the popular support for Diem erodes, and the communist support starts to grow. And we see that it's time to do something, right? Our President Eisenhower and Kennedy both commit additional forces, and this starts to grow over the period of time. President Kennedy deploys 100 Special Forces troops to go into South Vietnam as advisors initially, to help them shore up their fight against the communism. In 1962, 5,000 additional troops go in to protect against communist attacks in Laos. And then in 1964, they increased that number to 21,000. One of the key catalysts here that really shows the eroding of support for President Diem is a CIA-backed assassination and a coup to overthrow him by some generals in his army. And what happens initially, it's fascinating, is this really the plan of a low-level CIA operative who is in Vietnam, and he somehow calls through the White House switchboard and gets switched to President Kennedy, who is vacationing up in Massachusetts, and he talks to President Kennedy, and he kind of briefs him this plan. And Kennedy has no idea that this hasn't gone through staffing in his administration, in his cabinet, and he kind of blesses off on it, sends a cable over to go ahead and move forward with the operation, while not having vetted this through the Department of Defense and through his own close cabinet advisors. What happens is they go in middle of the night back in the United States when everybody is asleep and can't get any further guidance. They go in and they capture Deem and his brother, who's also an oppressive member of the regime, take him out of this Catholic church where they were worshiping in, and they execute them by stabbing and shooting them to death. And what really becomes acknowledged by the Kennedy administration and later the Nixon administration, a terrible mistake on behalf of the United States government to assassinate and remove an existing head of state. And it's the last time, really, that this type of thing happens with the backing of the United States government, and sets us up for, I think, a lot of problems in the future in Vietnam.